Note that His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services has also published the results of its inspection of the police effectiveness and efficiency, which found the management of offenders and suspects requires improvement and makes a number of observations which may warrant further exploration from the Department of Justice. A copy of this report can also be found in the pack. It's in table pack at pages 3 to 33. So I am going to welcome to the meeting our witnesses.
Just behind you. At some point,
Hi, how are you? You're very welcome, everyone, to the meeting, and I just want to welcome Hugh Wittes, Accounting Officer from the Department of Justice, Beverly Wall, Director of Reducing Offending Division and the Director General of the Northern Ireland Prison Service, Sean Holland, Director of Access to Justice, Department of Justice, Amanda Stewart, Chief Executive of the Probation Board for Northern Ireland, and Stuart Stevenson, Treasurer, Officer of Accounts, Department of Finance, and Dorina Carville, Controller and Auditor General of the NIAO. So Mr. Wittes, Ms Hall, Mr Holland and Ms Stewart, you're all very welcome to PAC, and thank you very much for agreeing to attend the committee today. So before we start, I just want to say, of course, you're very welcome. The committee here wants to make a real difference in Northern Ireland, and we want to get the best and the most evidence possible out of these public accounts committees. So I would just ask if you could provide us with a brief overview and introduction. Then we will obviously ask our questions, and we would ask if you could answer them honestly, to the point, and if we can get through this and get the most for everybody out of our session. So thank you very much.
Chair, really helpful. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having us. It is nice to be back in the Senate chamber. It seems like a while. So you've already introduced my colleagues, but we are very grateful for the opportunity to come and update you on the work we're doing in relation to addressing reoffending. I will try and keep these remarks brief as suggested, Chair, but if I could highlight a number of key areas, and then I'll do a very quick update on the individual recommendations. So very much welcome the report on reducing adult reoffending. I've just been speaking to the CNAG again outside about how useful it's been. So it continues to be a priority area for the department. It has long been. You will have seen that from the information. And that reflects the serious impact that offending has on victims, communities, families and the individuals themselves, and how we very much want to reduce it and reduce its impact. Key to all of our work in the department, and indeed with wider partners in the criminal justice system, is the aim to make the community safer through the rehabilitative and preventative work of the Prison Service, Probation Board, Department of Justice in this particular case, creating better outcomes and trying to break the offending cycle where we can do so, or help people break it themselves. So importantly, and again this is evidenced in the audit report, but we know that there's a range of societal factors which can lead to offending behaviour. These you will know include poor mental health, addictions, a lack of suitable accommodation, financial security, stable employment. I think everybody's agreed that if more can be done upstream in relation to this from a policy perspective to support individuals, research clearly shows that fewer then would come into the contact with the justice system, and we would have fewer victims and less harm. Second point here, I think the Audit Office recognises this, and again I think most participants in the system do. Justice cannot do this on its own, so we have charge of the criminal justice system. We have people when they come to us, but in terms of reducing those factors in society, in terms of helping people with support throughout their lives, that is something that is a whole of government and a whole of society issue, and part of the strategic approach is to try and make sure that we maximise the commitment and buy into that. A third point is that the department and the wider criminal justice system is continuing to operate, as are all departments in all sectors at the moment, in a very challenging financial climate. We can discuss some detail about that later on, but that's as well as a backdrop of a rising prison population, and because of the financial constraints, staffing pressures across the criminal justice system amongst partners here and partners not represented here today. For example, in the prison population between 2022 and 2025, our total population has gone up by 20%. So that is a very heavy challenge within the providing some of the context in which we try and provide our services. For a probation board, the number of orders and licences that they supervise has increased over the same period from just under 5,000 to pushing 6,000 over the last 2 years, from 2022 to 2024. Just for illustration, those facts, but they just do affect our ability to deliver on Invest to Save, a lot of which I suspect some of today's involvement might be, and certainly the Audit Office and our interest is very much about investing in the future, but our ability to do that is inevitably constrained by having to deal with the pressures of the present. If I could just touch then on each of the recommendations, Chair, if you're content. On recommendation 1, all about the programme for government and the strategic approach. So we've now secured a programme for government commitment, thanks to the Minister's involvement with the Executive, that there will be a new cross-governmental strategy to reduce offending and reoffending. We have reviewed our existing strategies in that regard in order to lead up to that moment and input into what's going to go into that proposed strategy. We've already commenced engagement in a very detailed way with colleagues across all the other departments and ALBs in order to begin the work on what might be in that in order to strengthen commitment to it. On recommendation 2, we've updated the annual cost of crime report. We've also just in the last few weeks finished our work on the reoffending, the cost of reoffending piece, which is referred to in the recommendation, and happy to get into that with you today. On recommendation 3, which is in and around the area of rehabilitation and support for short-term prisoners, for example, we've got a bespoke short sentence programme now in Maghaberry, which supports individual in custody and when they're transitioning back to the community. On recommendation 4, we are progressing legislation that will be coming to the House in the autumn. It's already been approved in principle by the Executive Committee and will be coming with expansion of community alternatives to custodial sentences. And recommendation 5 is also recommendation 4 is also in and around what we're doing on enhanced combination orders, and we're pleased to say we'll be able to roll those out yet further this year. On recommendation 5, we're progressing the development of a bail support scheme as a pilot for women initially, and we've secured funding to pilot that scheme again in this year, starting just after the summer. Recommendation 6 was about engagement with other jurisdictions. We've moved on that as well and established a 5 Nations policy group. It was very much Northern Ireland that pushed for that, but it's turned into a very useful intervention for all the participants involved, and it shares lessons learned and best practice on a range of issues. On recommendation 7, which is about management information, we've reviewed management information available to us and we continue to develop what we're doing there. On recommendation 8, we have progressed some of, perhaps not all of the problem-solving justice initiatives, but for example the substance misuse courts and indeed ECOs were in that bag as well. And then finally recommendation 9, which was about wider data collection and assistance pathways. We have been working with NISR, for example. We've done reviews of the ECO programme, we've done reviews of the ACE methodology. NISR have helped with that, and we are working towards better linkages of data from the criminal justice system, but also outside it, because we need the collaboration of other partners in relation to that. So that's a really quick rundown, Chair. I'm really happy to get into the detail, but that's where we are with progress so far and the recommendations in whatever it is, just over a year and a half since, a little bit more than that, since the report has come, and it's a summary of what we've done to date, and I'm really happy to get into discussion of these issues and their complexity with the committee.
No problem, and thank you very much, and thank you for that overview. I suppose before we get into the report, there was the HMIC FRS report that was published in relation to the PSNI effectiveness and efficiency this week, and you may have also listened to the Policing Board recently where they had discussed this too. So the PSNI obviously requires improvement in managing offenders and suspects, and the report highlighted several areas of concern in respect to offender management, particularly in respect to those involved in violence, sexual offences and child abuse. And it detailed a number of things such as the delays in processing records on the Violent and Sex Offenders Register, the lack of effective management of offenders on the Violence and Sex Offenders Register, and also delays in processing of child abuse images and electronic devices. So I suppose my question to yourself is, what risk does this present in respect of managing adult reoffending? And given the very well publicised financial and resourcing pressures on the PSNI, How does the department plan to address these recommendations?
So it's really helpful, Chair. Thank you very much. So the report is part of a kind of a rolling programme that the Inspectorate does in relation to policing in Northern Ireland. It was looking at a particular couple of areas of policing activity at the moment, and it's done to a kind of a national standard of performance that is expected across police across the whole of the UK. I have to be careful because there are operational issues in there. Very much the PSNI need to report on it, and the PSNI will need to put in their response in relation to it. I think there's always fair criticism in the same way that there is in audit office reports or CJR reports for us, HMI reports as well. In relation specifically to offenders in the community, there is some lap over with therefore reducing reoffending in the community. But I would be quite content that the police would have the actions in hand in order to address those things. They will have some of them in hand already, and having had the benefit of the full report, I'm sure they'll push on those as well. The Chief Constable, I think, or maybe it was the Deputy Chief Constable, has not unreasonably said, as with all other criminal justice organisations, we're operating in a really constrained financial environment, so the police service have had to make choices about where they dispose their resources. You will know that the Chief and indeed the Minister have a shared commitment to increasing policing numbers as well, and we have a business case well developed and well underway in order to provide some opportunity to rebuild the numbers in the police force in order to cater with that and other issues as well.
Okay. And just in regards to the Panam report, so it found again that practices in management of offenders under the Panam arrangements do not meet national standards, and information relating to risk assessments of these offenders is not easily accessible. So again, given these arrangements are intended to reduce the immediate and long-term risk of sexual or violent reoffending, what governance arrangements are in place to address these concerns and ensure that improvements can be made?
Well, I suppose I would say the report has only just landed and so on, so we're very happy to come back with more detail on it. But there are existing PAPANI arrangements which are about dealing with the most risky offenders once they're in the community and so on. I'm quite content that that structure is sound. It involves all of the partners and it operates at multiple levels, so it does it on an operational basis in relation to individuals, but it can also elevate and escalate issues if there's something policy-wise or strategy-wise that needs to be changed in relation to it. And again, I'm quite happy that the individual participants, and in this case the PSNI, will, I assume, take operational decisions to respond to the recommendation, and let us assume to strengthen whatever it is that they do in that area. If the Chief needs to come and talk to us about further finances in relation to that, we are very open to doing that, but our problem will be that we're allocated something to the department for the whole executive, we're allocated to the department amount for the whole sector. The executive is at this moment, or certainly today, considering the budget as I understand it for the year to come, and we will do what we can to support the PSNI and all the rest of the sector in terms of keeping people safe once those decisions are taken.
Thank you. And this is obviously very important, that the report that has came out and relates obviously directly with this, so I think it's something that we should obviously take into account. So just taking us back then to reducing adult reoffending within Northern Ireland, so I just want to kind of put into context, it's now nearly 2 years since the Audit Office produced this report on adult reoffending. So in this context, just to kind of set the scene for the committee today, can you give us an update on how the figures in relation to prison numbers and reoffending have changed since the Audit Office report, and also any improvements and initiatives you have introduced to reduce reoffending since that time?
No problem at all, Chair. In terms of prison numbers, I might ask Beverly just to help me with the absolute detail, but the prison population has continued to rise since the report was done in June 2023. So the current population, last time I saw the figures, was 1922 in the total estate.
So today our prison population is 1968, so the prison population continues to rise.
So it is definitely the case that population has continued to rise. We've also seen a rise in the female prison population as well, so it's at unusually high numbers just as a part of that population. Forgive me, you asked another part of the question about the numbers, Chair, was...
Yep, so it was just basically the relation to prison numbers and reoffending, how have they changed since the Audit Office report? So obviously it was done 2 years ago.
Yes.
So I'm just, in terms of the difference now, are you seeing an increase in reoffending, an increase in population, or a change in the demographics really of the prison population?
So the total number in the adult reoffending cohort is now 3184, the last figures that I have, which were 21-22. There's a lag on us being able to report on these things, naturally because it's about reoffending, you have to map after and so on. And that, from recollection, is a slight increase, but I suspect not a statistically significant one since the date of the report. The total adult cohort offending is also at 18,335. So again, that's not, if you take the COVID years out of consideration for that, that's not, I think, a dramatic change. Although the whole thing is representative of an ongoing downward trend from, in relation to the first figure, it was at 4,875 a decade ago. So we've got the total number of adult reoffending cohort down from something like 4,900 down to 3,184. So while there hasn't been that much change in that cohort in the last couple of years, there is an overall trend to bring it down. And similarly, the total adult cohort of offenders has reduced from 30,000 down to that 18,000 figure. We can give you more precise figures on those, Chair, but the general trend continues to be downward for the overall cohort. I'm sure the committee is also interested, because there's some focus in the Audit Office report on the reoffending rate, so that's the proportion of those two figures that I've given to each other, and it is currently at 17.4%. So again, it had dropped to something like 16 during COVID, but it has, generally speaking, fluctuated around 16, 17, now 17.4%. I think the high point was 18.4. So it is that rate, which is the comparison between the total cohort of offenders and then the amount of reoffending, is proving stubborn. But overall, the number of reoffenders in the system has been reducing quite noticeably over the period that we're tracking, which is 2010 through to 21-22. And then, forgive me, initiatives that we've done since the report.
Yep, just any improvements or initiatives that you have introduced to reduce reoffending since then.
I could probably speak all afternoon on it, but if I picked some, for example, in relation to short sentences, we've introduced a bespoke short sentence programme because we recognise that short sentence prisoners are rather hard to reach, so we've revised what we're doing in relation to that. On learning and skills, for example, we have boosted and secured very substantial increase in the number of people who are getting qualifications while with us inside the prison estate. We have put an awful lot of people through our approach with housing advisors from the housing executive to try and help solve accommodation problems as people are leaving prison. So clearly accommodation and lack of stable accommodation is known to be a factor that contributes to reoffending. So we've put an awful lot of people through those. For example, 50 homelessness decisions have been made by housing executive as a result of those initiatives happening. And similarly, we've had work coaches into prison which are helping people with employability and skills beyond the pure education piece. And for example, a very substantial number of, 1,600 appointments have happened in prison since February 2023, which isn't quite the date of the report, but it's a useful figure to have. So there are an awful lot of initiatives that have happened since then. I could probably mention ECO's being further rolled out. We can talk to you about that as well. We've got a bail support pilot programme ready to go this year. So it isn't as though the department has been sitting on its hands with the report waiting for the PAC to reach it in its rota of consideration and invite us to come and talk to us about it. We have been continuing to progress in relation to it. At a more strategic level, I suppose it's worth saying Probation Board have been advancing with its general agenda. Prisons have been advancing their 25 by 25 programme, which is the latest iteration of change and transformation in the prison service, a substantial portion of which is targeted towards looking after people when they are with us and trying to prevent their reoffending, and B, helping them transition properly back into the community environment once they're finished with us.
Thank you. Just want to touch on the statistics there, just in terms of benchmarking or in comparison to other jurisdictions. Is that something that you would look at as a department, and where would you look and how are you seeing that comparison?
So we do, and we definitely benchmark in all sorts of ways. So I mentioned, for example, the establishment of the Five Nations group, which is intended to do that. The benchmarking the reoffending rate and benchmarking things like the cost of reoffending are difficult. And I think the Audit Office report accepts that the feasibility of direct comparison, because of the way crime is measured, because of the way offending is measured, because of the way reoffending is measured in the different jurisdictions across the UK and indeed Ireland as well, that can be difficult. But we do continue where we can to measure it. So, for example, the straight prison population per 100,000 in Northern Ireland is noticeably lower than England and Wales and Scotland. So we have 98 persons per 100,000 in the prison population, whereas, for example, the Scottish and I think the England and Wales figure at the moment is more like 140. So where we can, we definitely do measure and benchmark ourselves, but kind of direct read across isn't always possible just because of those data differences in terms of how it's completed.
Thank you. So I'm going to pass over now to Colin. Thank you.
Thank you. So I suppose I would have a prior knowledge of this area from some of the work I done previously as a social worker, and actually just the kind of very rapid awareness that I gained of the absolute dependence that many of our sectors, including schools, PSNA, social services and families, the desire and the need to have diversionary supports and to deal with reoffending and indeed offending. So I suppose it's almost the case that, and I'm very conscious of the pressures the PSNA numbers are under, but almost the less police you have, the more resource you need to put into addressing offending and reoffending, and maybe that can be difficult. I understand that. But I have a couple of questions, I suppose, specifically. So there appear to be two long-standing key strategic documents on the issue of managing reoffending that are being used: Strategic Framework 2013 and a Desistance Strategy in 2015. Given those were never formally evaluated and that both of them were already quite dated at the time and indeed now, can you explain why you consider that both of those remain fit for purpose at this point in time?
Absolutely. So the first of those comes from 2013. The second that's the strategic framework. The desistance strategy comes from 2015. We recognise that is a considerable period of time. We also recognise that a lot of context has changed since. So, for example, we discussed the change in the prison population. There's a very high number of remand population. There's also a lot more complexity in the driving factors that are leading to crime, and a lot more complexity in the lives of people who come our way and come into the system. So we would see a lot more complex mental health issues or addiction issues or accommodation issues or familial issues, etc., as people come in, and perhaps in society more generally. I think it is, we have done a review. So again, part of the recommendation was we should review those two as a kind of an overarching framework, and we have done that. That review is completed, and it recognises, for example, that while the kind of core vision in it, or the core approach of identifying the criminogenic factors like accommodation, health, mental health, education, etc., that lead people or are kind of society drivers which generate a certain amount of crime, we recognise that those things are still sound. All the research is telling us those are sound. But the approach, for example, of the strategic framework, which didn't have an associated action plan, we think needs to be revised. And the desistance framework, which had an action plan but perhaps didn't have clear measurement of targets and so on. So we are very much using that review that we've already done of those two in order to feed into the draft overarching new strategy, which will be about reducing offending and reoffending as going to PFG. So it isn't so much that we think it's still absolutely fit for purpose and doesn't need to be changed. We do absolutely recognise that it needs to be changed, and the learning from that review will feed into the new draft, which will be worked up with all of our partners and so on, and then it will be brought to the Minister and eventually to the Executive. It's worth saying as well, even though those were some time ago, we have continued with other strategic interventions which define what we're doing, again, all trying to deal with that same approach of identifying the criminogenic factors and going at them. So I've mentioned Prisons 2020. We have a strategic framework for youth justice, which has been adopting a similar approach and has shown very good successes in relation to reoffending in the youth sphere, and similarly in terms of probation approach. So it isn't as though we've just kind of sat back and let those things expire and done nothing for 10 years. We have used the general approach which they espouse to inform a lot of our activity, and we now recognise, and this is the right moment, that we have a new minister and we have an executive back to garner the kind of cross-government, all-of-government collaborative approach to make this truly successful to reduce offending and reoffending.
And in terms of best practice more widely, what other reports are you looking at, or where else does this better, or where is the exemplar in your opinion in terms of globally around reoffending and offending rates?
We've done some initial, I might ask Beverly just to come in on that in a second, but we've certainly done some initial scoping work about good markers elsewhere. We have, as I mentioned, this 5 nations policy group, which is us, Scotland, England, Wales, the Republic of Ireland, all pooling knowledge, all pooling skills, showing what has worked well, what has not worked well, and so on. And we will use all of that to try and inform really good examples.
Thinking beyond that, a more global, wider look.
Could I ask Beverly to speak to that?
And so what we are doing in the developing of the new strategy is not just looking at the positive impact of the youth justice framework, which focus very much on early intervention diversionary work, which we know when it comes to an adult strategy for reducing offending and reoffending, we need to work with other departments on. So we've already started that engagement and are engaging with other departments on what they see should be included within a new strategy. But we've also...
I'm thinking, whereabouts in the world have better offend, or, whereabouts could we compare to in terms of other nations?
And look, we will always look within a prison space to the Nordic countries.
I suspected that might be.
But significant investment there. We're working within constrained budgets. So in developing the strategy, yes, we are looking at research from other countries, and we are engaging through our 5 Nations group within the 5 nations closest to us. But yes, within that research, we will look at others. But there will always be those constraints.
It would appear that investment pays off. Okay, thank you. The Audit Office report says reducing reoffending strategic outcomes group, which the DOJ established in May 2017, decided that a formal strategy for reducing reoffending was not required. Can you explain why this opportunity to place the management of reoffending on a more strategic footing wasn't taken, and have any lessons been learnt from that?
Well, I suppose the decision was taken with the knowledge of what I've just said in mind, which is that we had identified, and I think all the research still continues to confirm, that we are in the right general trajectory for what you would do to both reduce offending and to reduce reoffending, and that has informed any amount of work both within prisons and in probation practice and elsewhere in order to continue that drive to get the cohort down. Whether a new strategic framework was needed at that time or not was a decision that was taken at the time. We totally recognise now we need to revise the framework. We need to think again about how we would apply all that learning that we have, continue to validate it, think about it, what it means at present and what has changed in terms of that science, and as you say, the example from Nordic countries and elsewhere, but then also apply it to the fairly substantial changes in context that we have, and they are very much increase in prison population, increase in complexity, and I'm really sorry to say, but restrained financial circumstances for the moment. So it will be used to do that at the moment, and we are beginning to do all that very solid work in relation to preliminary work in order to do, in order to put out then a call for evidence, which will allow all sorts of people to come forward with good ideas for how we can make this as effective as we can. Yeah.
Given then the financial constraints, and those are real, there's no question about it, so then you have to look at what else you can do better. So the committee across various different things have looked at cross-departmental work and how that could be improved. In the context of the new programme for government and the previous draft programme for government, what progress has been made on developing a cross-governmental strategy to reduce offending and reoffending?
So as I was saying there, in relation to the previous strategy and the previous PFG, which was some time ago now, we continued to roll out programmes, for example, Prisons 25 by 25, work in the probation sector. ECOS itself has been done since the last programme for government. We now have this brand new programme for government, and not only I think is it clearly speaking to the world at large about better collaboration across all sorts of activity in government, not just reoffending, not just justice issues, but everything. But very specifically, the executive has put a pin in it and said we are giving a commitment that we will have in our safer priorities, in our safer communities priority, one of our actions will be we will have an executive approval of a cross-departmental strategy on reducing offending and reoffending, and then the developmental work on that is exactly what Beverly was speaking already engaged on.
Can I just check with you, did you say one of the factors at the very start was, you'd mentioned housing, which is one of the ones I have here, mental health, addiction, financial security you mentioned, is that poverty?
Forgive me, I don't know if I did say financial security, but poverty is definitely a criminogenic factor which is known to increase the probability of crime occurring.
So I'm just wondering if we're using, and maybe we're not, like maybe that was just a phrase you used, but if we're describing the same thing in different terms, does that make it more difficult to map across departments? Because we're finding very often that there's very simple solutions to working better, and sometimes just misunderstandings or misaligning as a result of descriptions. So that is poverty, financial security. So can you give us any examples of where you are working with other departments in relation to housing or mental health or addiction to reduce reoffending?
Absolutely, and for example in the sphere of homelessness we do, and we fed into the anti-poverty strategy. Maybe Beverly?
I suppose what I would say is since this report was published and prior to that report, we've continued to focus on that enhanced rehabilitation support both in and out of custody, and to do that we've been working with other departments. So we work closely with colleagues in Department for Communities and also in the Housing Executive and with our voluntary and community sector partners to do that. So in respect of housing support, we bring housing advisors. We brought housing advisors into the prison setting. We brought work coaches and make the call benefit advisors into the prison setting to provide that advice and support to prisoners before they leave us, and also to their families, while they are with us. In terms of debt and benefit advice, we're providing that to prisoners while they're with us. So we're focusing on the factors that we know have an impact on reoffending, and that's accommodation, employment, and access to benefits or financial security. And in an employment space, I suppose what we're doing there is where we've reviewed our education curriculum within the prison setting. We've reviewed and revised that to take account of labour market needs, and working closely with colleagues in Department for Communities around work coaches within prisons, and that successfully led to 59 people to date leaving prison and going straight into employment. But also working with the private sector. So we're working to build on our relationships with the private sector to extend the Ban the Box campaign, and also to set up an employers forum to support people to find jobs and to secure employment post-release.
And very briefly, if I may, Chair, just so it's clear that you understand the need for other departments to play their part, and I agree with that. Do they understand it as fully, the role they can play in reducing reoffending and offending?
And we have already started those conversations with those departments, primarily with the departments that we are already working closely with. So, for example, Department of Health, Department for Communities, Department for Economy. We're also meeting with colleagues in Department for Education and the Executive Office to have those conversations, those early conversations, as we start to scope out what the content of a strategy would be. But in doing so, looking at the strategies they have in place. So, for example, an anti-poverty strategy, because we know that over 90% of the people who come into a prison setting come from one of the top 10% most deprived communities in Northern Ireland. So we know that the direct link is with poverty.
If I could add briefly, Chair, to Mr. Gilnew's question. So the answer is yes, every other department does absolutely know. They probably don't understand all of the detail of what we will say and what we'll bring in front of them on each individual case. But the core idea of cooperating to drive out change, or to make change which will drive out the kind of factors that lead people to, everybody gets that. Everybody is utterly committed to doing it. The task for us and the challenge for us will be translating that into the coordinated series of actions which actually make the change, and persuading not just the departments but then the ministers and the executive as a whole to commit to that and to buy into it, and then we will be able to deliver it. But the absolute commitment is there on this, and actually on pretty much every other large problem in society where there is an interconnection across different sectors. You will find all of the departments do understand that. It's translating it into an advance on how we can dig into it and undermine it and get rid of it. That's the challenge that lies ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I probably should have actually declared the interest of being Chair of Communities in advance of that, but I'll do so now.
Thank you, Colin. I'm just going to bring Diane in and then Catherine.
Yeah, just a brief one. Colin was talking about the cross-governmental strategy, and I had noticed that you had put a bid under the transformation project, mentioning the lack of integrated data systems and with a view to transforming public services and linking into that, although that was rejected in this round of the transformation. I was just wondering, is that something that you're planning to take forward as a cross-departmental programme?
So we put a number of bids in, and actually we were quite successful because we got 2 bids supported in the end out of the total 6 that were supported. So I pay tribute to the colleagues in the department who prepared the bids and so on, and those who pushed them through, and also the colleagues on the transformation board who selected them. But an awful lot of work was done. We did have one which was specifically in relation to reducing reoffending, which is probably what the committee's most interested in. It was comprised of a number of things, and the data analysis piece was just one of them. What we have done is even though we haven't been able to drive forward, for example, even though we didn't get the bid and therefore use bid money to drive forward, we have identified and prioritised some resource in the department, for example, to deliver the eco part of it, and separately to deliver bail support out of that as well. There was a relatively small portion of the bid, which I think from memory was 2 data analysts, is that correct? So we haven't currently been able to fund that, but we are doing everything we can in relation to the resources that we have generally to push forward better use of data and information. And indeed, happy to get onto it later, but have been pushing and working with colleagues in NISRA, for example, about the cross-departmental use of data and strategy. Sorry, Beverly.
Yeah, just to say that we're engaging with NISRA colleagues around those data linkages, because we know that when people leave prison, it's difficult for us to trace their journey unless they reoffend and come back into prison custody. So we've been engaging with colleagues in NISRA around how we can better improve those data linkages across departments.
Forgive me, I should add, you've developed the outcomes dashboard in relation to at least 3 of the factors, isn't that right?
Yeah. So we're working already with NISRA on outcomes dashboards around those key factors of accommodation, learning and skills and addictions, to develop an outcomes dashboard on that. And we've already worked to improve on our management information in respect of our prison population, both remand and sentenced, and then our reoffending rates.
Thank you. Cathal?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Q, you're very welcome, and your team. Thanks very much for your answers so far. Of a number of questions, obviously. The first one is that the Criminal Justice Inspectorate has repeatedly highlighted the need for improved performance measures which looks at longer term outcomes. The Audit Office report also stated that there is insufficient clarity on the measures taken by the Department which are achieving greatest impact. So my question is, has there been any tangible improvement in relation to outcome measurement in recent years?
I think there absolutely has. So again, I do take the point that in the 2013 and the 2015 strategic framework documents, there was perhaps less of that than we might have envisaged, but that very much is a learning point which we have applied since then, and it is a learning point which will be taken into the new strategy. In terms of, for example, programmes like Prisons 2020, there were something like 282 actions in it and a set of outcomes we were trying to achieve as a result of it. And from recollection, Beverly, correct me if I'm wrong, but 95% of them were achieved and delivered. So over a period of time when maybe some become a bit irrelevant or whatever, 95% achievement is pretty high. And on the 25 by 25, which is the name we've given to the next iteration of that, we're not quite closed on it yet, isn't that right? But we're nearly there, and I know you're working on the next iteration.
Yeah. And so we're working then to develop for the next year, and we'll link that with any new strategy being developed.
The Audit Office also highlighted gaps in management information, in particular the proportion of short-term prisoners that receive rehabilitative support before release, and also in relation to monitoring reoffending rates amongst remand prisoners. Is this kind of basic information available yet?
Yeah. So we have improved our management information. We now publish monthly prison population dashboards for remand and sentenced, and also reoffending data. We have key performance indicators for each prison establishment, and we have management information around drug testing within each of the prison establishments. We've also, as I've said, we were improving our outcomes measurement in respect of wider interventions, such as accommodation, addictions and learning and skills, stroke of employment, and we're going to use those insights to inform that rehabilitation model.
Okay, thank you. The Audit Office highlighted that whilst the total annual economic and social costs of audit reoffending in England and Wales has been estimated at 16.77 billion. Very little was known about the extent of these costs in the north. Have you done any work to estimate these costs per NI?
We absolutely have. So members may be aware of an earlier report, which is the cost of crime, so not specifically reoffending, which we had done at an earlier time, and we have updated that since the Audit Office report. So that has estimated the cost of crime as a whole to Northern Ireland society. We've also, that has begun that's kind of a gateway project to getting completed then the cost of reoffending as a kind of a subset of that, and we've completed that bit of work as well. The cost of crime report has been signed off internally at the department from recollection. It's for publication very rapidly, and it has come out with a figure of 3.4 billion being the annual cost of crime in 21-22 to Northern Ireland society and government. In relation to the cost of reoffending, again, really useful recommendation from the report, and we now have a figure which is 374 million in Northern Ireland being the cost of reoffending. And again, as Beverly was saying, we will use that knowledge to kind of design interventions and identify the scale of the problem and identify therefore, in an ideal world, the scale of the correct money to put into it in terms of trying and avoid it and spend it in a value for money way to the satisfaction of the committee and everybody else. But we do, the straight answer is yes. I'm just trying to give you a bit more detail about the fact of we've done it, but also the amounts.
And you've answered my next question.
Right.
Thank you very much, Chair. Okay.
Thank you. Kath, I'll move on to David.
Come in, sorry.
That David.
Right, sort of looking at short-term prisoners kind of over the next bit. So when we look at the release of kind of long-term prisoners, there's the preparation and work that goes into that. How does that compare to short-term prisoners?
Really?
Okay, well, we're very conscious of the high levels of remand within remand population within prisons in Northern Ireland, higher than any other jurisdiction. And what we've done is reviewed and revised our rehabilitation model to take account of that. So when, in terms of our education provision, we're providing short courses for those who are held on remand or in short sentences, 12-week programmes around things like essential skills, health and safety in the workplace. We've also worked then with voluntary community sector organisation Extern to develop a prisoner support project, which is providing support to prisoners who are in short sentences prior to the release and post-exit for 6 months. That's a 2-year programme, and early indications are that programme is being very successful. We'll have an interim evaluation of that shortly. There are also a range of other measures we've put in place. So we've put in place peer mentoring to provide support both in prison and then working with voluntary community sector organisations. We've put in a funding bid to look to extend that peer mentoring once people leave us. We've put in structured release planning, so exit passports for all prisoners when they leave us to ensure that they have identification, they have access to a GP, and they've been given housing advice before they leave us. We've a directory of services now for short sentence and remand prisoners that explains to them the services that are available to them whilst they're in prison. And we've also focused on family support because we know that family support is key, and working with, again, voluntary community sector partners around family links and maintaining those family links while those individuals are with us. And that's just, some of the programmes, but we have in place a range of programmes targeted just at those short sentence and remand prisoners.
Can I add, forgive me, Chair, Mr. Honeyford, so as well as what we're doing once they are with us, we're also conscious that the population is very high, so interventions which can provide alternatives to the judiciary as opposed to giving a short sentence. For example, we are, as mentioned, we think the ECO as an alternative to that is a great success. I don't know if Amanda wants to speak to that briefly, and then also we're trying to do what we can to legislate to provide the judiciary with other options. And we did a sentencing review a number of years ago, and one of the outcomes of that will be featuring in the sentencing bill coming forward reasonably shortly as well, which is about adding a community element to a suspended sentence. So it increases the judicial armoury of options that they have to penalise people and get some payback into the community, rather than necessarily feeling that they're limited to giving a short sentence. Amanda, do you want to speak on ECOs briefly?
Yes, thanks, Hugh. Just by example, in terms of ECO, it is an alternative to a short prison sentence, and it is directed by a judge where they're minded to give a sentence of less than 12 months. And it was really developed in 2016 in response to some of the addiction and mental health issues that were particularly common before judges whenever they were faced with short prison sentences. It didn't require change in legislation, and it was developed alongside with the judiciary and also with the Criminal Justice Board, and it is really an enhancement to what we have already. So it's wraparound support in terms of a combination order. At the minute is a combination of community service and a probation order, which would be supervision and community service. So it's an enhancement to a combination order with further wraparound support. And I suppose in a sense the reason why they have been so effective and why we're keen to really make sure that they are rolled out across all court areas is that they don't disrupt the positive influences in somebody's life when they go into prison for a very short period of time, in terms of losing their job, potentially losing their accommodation, family links, and also some of the issues that are associated with prison, and coming out within a very short space of time and having to deal with all of that again. They are robust sentences. They involve probation supervision. There's an assessment by a psychologist to deal with some of the mental health issues. There are a number of hours community service which somebody is required, or an offender is required to do. And there would also be other additional aspects added on to the licence condition. And I suppose in a sense for us the attractiveness is also that reparation to the community and giving back through that community sentence piece, because very often what I say is that people go back into community once they come out of prison, and there is a place for the community to put that support in place, and community service is absolutely valuable in terms of doing that. Just by way of the some of the data around the effectiveness, we've had 2 pilots. The first one was in 2015 in the Ards and Armagh court area, and the second one was then in the Northwest, and there was an evaluation of those. So while the reoffending rates for people coming out from prison are sitting around 50% in terms of ECO, really across each of the years we've seen a reduction from 41% in 17-18 when the first ECO cohort was introduced, to 28% in 2021, and then 31%. There was a slight rise in it in the most recent cohort that we received. But interestingly, it also showed a reduction in those 2 court areas of 20% less short prison sentences, and that's why we're really keen that it is an effective order in terms of reoffending, and it is also better value for money and deals with those long-term issues around the reoffending and the societal impact of people coming out of prison.
Okay. You can answer quite a bit of next. Whenever I look at this evaluation in 2019, you were talking 20. So I'm trying to see when that changes happened. But 2019, the POST project, or the positive outcomes for short-term prisoners, found there was a lack, or was lacking in many respects. What is the current rehabilitation program? Is what you're saying has changed since that, or is the current rehabilitation program for short-term prisoners? How do we ensure it's been effective as we move forward?
And I suppose what I'd say is that's a challenge for us in measuring the impact through the gate. So we can measure the outcomes for an individual while they're with us, for example, around improved educational qualifications, around support for substance misuse. The challenge is in measuring that impact when they leave us, and that's where we are focusing on better data linkages, and also we'll be focusing across executive strategy.
Are you talking with other departments?
We're working with other departments on linking our data, yes. So, for example, that data would colleagues, for example, in Department for Communities would have on benefit uptake, or Department for Economy and Employment, that we could make better use of that, really, to track people through before they arrive with us and after they leave us.
So I'm trying to work out, when somebody leaves out, are they still under your, whenever you're tracking data and you're tracking statistics of that, is it still under your care, or does that become, I'm confused.
Yes. So when someone leaves prison, our ability to know anything about that prisoner is strictly limited. unless we can access any engagement they've had with another department, which we don't have at the moment. We don't
So
have those.
are you saying you track that through?
We can't at the moment. Where we are doing that is with the pilot. We're delivering the prisoner support project that we're piloting at the moment, because that's allowing us to track a prisoner before they leave us, and then for 6 months after they leave us, so that we will have, at the end of that 2-year pilot programme, we will know from that cohort who have gone through that programme what impact that has had in respect of their reoffending.
Okay, my last question was to ask you around those short-term prisoners, of how they're not subject to that post-custody supervision on release. Or you talked about through the gate, which was a new term for me. I was reading through the pack, but the support seems to be far more advanced in the rest of the UK. But what is that the case, or are you? No, just the way you're looking at me.
My view would be, from our engagement through the Five Nations group, Northern Ireland is not doing anything different. There's nothing being done in other jurisdictions that we're not already doing or seeking to do. So, for example, bail support as an alternative to custody is something that we saw as being delivered in other jurisdictions, and we are developing that as a pilot in Northern Ireland. And that's really one of the key things we're seeing that's happening across other jurisdictions that we're not currently delivering. But in terms of our the support that we're providing by way of rehabilitation, no, there's nothing significant that we're seeing others doing that we're not doing.
Sorry,
I remember.
Go ahead.
Just to add to it, so when people come into our system, we can work with them, and then depending on how they're released, or whether they're on licence, or whether there's any kind of community supervision, we as a sector can continue to work with them. But long after that, they're gone out of our bit of the system. They're still in the much bigger government system. We're all, as a government, obliged to and expected to assist and so on. So really, where we would love to get to in the strategy is making sure that A, from a data point of view, and B, from a kind of a service design point of view, we can identify, without talking about individuals, but if there's a cohort of people who've been through prison and have done a lot of rehabilitation work with us, not to lose all that just for the sake of, for example, some addition actions from communities for the next 2 years, or in health provision to them for the period after that, or whatever. So there's a piece of work to do in relation to that, and we very much hope the strategy will guide what we are all going to do in relation to it.
I suppose you've said a couple of times now, we've started discussions, or there's a piece of work to do, or it's that piece whenever they leave. So what is the buy-in? You need buy-in ultimately from Department of Health, or communities, or education, or all of it, I suppose, wraps around economy, all of the departments. But are you getting that buy-in from the other departments?
In the sense of everybody understanding what the problem is, albeit perhaps not in all the detail, because we're masters of that at the moment, but we're trying to get everybody to help to understand it. Absolutely, I was trying to indicate that, I think, to Mr. Gilden earlier. Any discussions we'd have with any partners in this sphere, everybody's content, but the task will be everybody's content to assist with it and play their part. The task will be to actually turn that willingness into actually hard actions, and then investment in the right areas, some of which might not actually be even through the gate. It might be much earlier in people's lives to kind of generate the circumstances where they simply don't end up in the criminal justice system at all, either as victims, from an overall perspective, and what we're trying to achieve, and certainly as the individuals who've committed the crime.
We did our first inquiry was actually on mental health, and as you're saying that, you're reminding me of nearly the evidence that was given at that point. Is that early intervention was solved so much rather than firefighting at the end. But thank you.
Thank you. Just wanted to pick up on that in terms of the data and the analysing piece. It was mentioned in the report about a hardcore group of reoffenders. Is that something that you would analyse, understand the rationale why, understand their makeup, and how to best help them? Is that something that you have ever looked at?
Certainly in relation to the general factors that lead people towards crime and so on, and you can identify when people come into our system and we would do a prisoner needs assessment in relation to each of them and so on. So we know, for example, Something like 75% have left school age at age 16. Something like 37% have no qualifications at the moment, like no qualifications at all by the time they come to us. So about 63% have used drugs. So the answer is yes, we know a lot about that cohort. And then clearly the interventions that might hold people in school longer clearly would be likely to have a policy impact on the cohort of people who come to us possibly years after their school ages and so on. So the answer is yes, we know quite a lot about that cohort, and we're trying to apply that learning. And other departments, don't get me wrong, it's not that we have a lot of way to go and nothing is happening at the moment. We do loads with other departments at the moment. We do loads with other partners at the moment. Beverly and colleagues will do release planning for each individual prisoner before they go out. There's a lot of collaboration with the voluntary community sector in relation to that. We have a lot of individual programs and specified support. Everybody get the agenda is to make sure that everybody leaves with an exit passport, which essentially is identifying that's your GP, that's your accommodation, that's your social security, etc. So that is all readied with the prisoner and the services as much as we can before they go. And then we do an awful lot, for example, with Extern, who have this short sentence prisoner program, which very much crosses before the gate and through the gate. And again, Extern are they're delivering a lot of that, which is kind of beyond our technical responsibility and ability to act. But Extern have stepped into that space and are helping those short sentence prisoners transition back into the environment.
Just in terms of the exit passport, how is that working here in Northern Ireland in comparison to elsewhere? Is it to the same standard, or are we lagging behind in that regard?
I don't know the answer to that, Chair.
What I will say in terms of all of our rehabilitation work, the increasing growth and the continued growth of our prison population and the continued complexity and increasing complexity of our prison population is really putting our rehabilitation efforts under strain, just as other jurisdictions are experiencing in terms of their rehabilitation delivery and programme delivery. And what we are doing in recognition of that, increase in prison population, and recognising the increasing complexity of that, we're undertaking a review of our prisoner development model, which is the rehabilitation model we use within prisons, to ensure that remains fit for purpose and can respond fully to the needs and the complexities of the prisoners that we see today.
Thank you. Sorry, Patrick?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for your presentation, your answers so far. I'm aware that I want to touch on the short-term custodial sentences as well, so there will be overlap with some of the answers you've already provided, but I wouldn't mind just if you could provide any more detail just on that. My first question really is around the fact that we obviously have a higher rate of those short-term sentences than England, Scotland, Wales, and among the 5 nations that you've mentioned as well in the south. So in terms of that, what is the department doing to address that? And also, can you give me any information on the fact that short-term prisoners obviously receive a lot less rehabilitation support, and in terms of their, do you think that really impacts their likelihood of reoffending?
Really helpful, Mr. Larkin, thank you. I suppose I would reiterate, we're doing a lot. For example, everybody, short-term, long-term, everybody remand has access to rehabilitation and resettlement initiatives under the prisoner development model, so that applies to everybody who comes into the prison's estate in all 3 of the prisons. We have done an external review of that model, or we haven't quite completed it yet, but it's underway just to make sure it is as sound and adequate as it could be. That will apply to short-term and try and deal with the fact that there's a rising number of short sentence prisoners in the system. It also is intended to take account of the rising or the high proportion of remand prisoners as well. We've done things, I think, as Beverly was indicated, about our education curriculum, for example, introducing shorter programs, quicker programs. The average, forgive me, it's not the average short sentence, the average time on remand, for example, not quite what you asked about, but it's only 58 days, so it's actually, that's an average, but it's a really short time to try and meaningfully help people examine their own lives and examine what they're doing and so on. But we have done what we can to introduce shorter programs. A short sentence directory of services, directory of initiatives has been made available to all prisoners as well. And then, as Beverly was saying, we're also doing things, and for example, helping with housing, helping with employability, helping with skills development while they're with us and so on. So those are all there. The exit passport is just discussed, I suppose, as a mechanism there as well. That's all inside. The piece outside then very much is trying to provide alternatives. So we've already discussed ecos, but we're looking at, for example, this community sentence element being added onto a suspended sentence, the purpose of which is to assist the judiciary in feeling that they have yet another option available rather than a short sentence. And Sean, do you want to say a few words about it?
Yeah, absolutely. As Permanent Secretary mentioned earlier, that this stemmed from the sentencing review work that was done. And work was done to look at what options could be developed that might reduce the number of short sentences being given. 3 different options were considered. We looked at whether we could add community provisions to conditional discharges, deferred sentences and suspended sentences. Now, conditional discharges, after consideration, it was felt that might lead to increased criminalisation of people who weren't really at the threshold of receiving a custodial sentences. Deferred sentences already, in a sense, have a community condition because there's normally the sentence is deferred while the person is required to do something. So we focused on suspended sentences because we thought that was probably where the biggest payback, biggest return on investment was going to be, because people who are likely to get a suspended sentence are going to be those who are on the threshold of potentially getting a custodial sentence. Now, there is a challenge in that currently, I think over the past 10 years, I think the average has been between 3,500 and 4,000 suspended sentences a year. Now, if we were to add community provisions to all of those, that would in effect need to double the size of the probation agency, which isn't practical or necessary. So what we're looking at, I mean, we have the provisions in the legislation that will be hopefully coming before the Assembly in the autumn, which will allow for community conditions to be added to suspended sentences. It'll be introduced on a phased approach, and the thinking is that it should initially focus on those cases in the Crown Court at the higher end of the seriousness of offence spectrum. So people who would otherwise really stand a very significant chance of going into custody will have the option, or the judiciary will have the option, of giving a suspended sentence with a community dimension added to it. So that's significant. I mean, the other thing, we've been asked a few times today about benchmarking. We do carefully look at what's happening in other jurisdictions. So we look very closely at what happened in Scotland, where they introduced legislation with a presumption against a short sentence. In effect, they said if a sentence is going to be 3 months or under, it shouldn't be issued. And quite quickly, what appears to have happened is that judges began what they call up-tariffing, so where they might have given a 3-month sentence, they gave a 6-month sentence. And indeed, that legislation has now been amended to make it less than a 12-month sentence, and that hasn't been commenced yet. So, and England was also considering a similar provision. That fell at the general election, and they now are not looking, there are currently no plans for them to introduce a provision like that. They have commissioned another sentencing review, and one of the focuses on that will be how you address short sentences. It should be making its recommendations known in the coming months. We're going to look very, very closely at that because, to be frank, they've got much more policy capacity to look at these issues than we have. So we're very anxious to learn by benchmarking against those other jurisdictions.
Okay, thanks for that. That's very helpful. And I just want to probe the ecos a bit. Just in your previous comments about that, you've gone into some detail on those and some of the other short-term kind of alternatives that you were looking at as well. And obviously from the evidence, from your evidence and from others, they've been very effective. And the evidence points that way that they have been effective, but they also have the potential to be even more effective where they're rolled out more widely. So if we look at why they maybe haven't been rolled out as fully, what is the rationale behind that? Is it purely financial? And if so, surely there's a net saving by doing so. And I suppose my next question from that would be, do you think the fact that we're kind of funding things on an annual cycle rather than a 3-year cycle has a huge impact on that? Can you talk around what is the impact and why?
Really helpful, Ms. Lord, and I might ask Amanda to fill in the details, but broadly speaking, the answer is yes. So we have evaluated ecos on a number of occasions now. It clearly shows they are effective in terms of meeting their policy objectives. They're also very effective from an economic perspective. So, for example, the average cost per life of an eco is around £10,000. The average benefit to society is £15,000 per order, and those are 2019 figures. So you can see, that 15,000 pounds is a 2019 figure. So there's clearly, from a PAC perspective, there's a value for money for that, but also it is simply a better outcome generally in terms of the policy objective of preventing reoffending. It has, as Amanda was indicating, it has this impact of reducing short sentences where we piloted it, and it has lower reoffending rates than custodial sentences insofar as they're comparable would do. So the answer is yes. I mean, the case is essentially made to have them. The obstacle has entirely been absence of funding to roll it out fully across Northern Ireland. So we have it in place in a number of areas where those evaluations are done. We put a transformation bid in relation to this. It was not successful. The Minister then looked, when she was proposing allocations inside the department and inside the sector this year, and has agreed to prioritise some money towards it. Relatively small amount of money, but it's about £500,000 from memory, but it allows us to roll it out in Ballymena, Antrim, Coleraine. And I might ask Amanda just take it from there in terms of any more detail on how effective it is.
Hugh, I think you've more or less covered it, and I have said in terms of just the effectiveness of them. I suppose your question was in relation to what has prevented them. Financial constraints absolutely is, and the one-year funding makes it very difficult because I have to recruit staff, and then there's a commitment whenever you start to bring staff into the organisation, that it isn't just a one-year process. I would like to get to a position where we have a planned rollout of ECO across all court areas. And I'm absolutely certain that the department would support me if they did have the money, but it has largely been an issue in terms of funding. It hasn't been the will to do it, either within Probation Board or the department. The other areas that had impacted at that time, it was due to be rolled out just at the onset of COVID into the third court area, and obviously then that was stood down and the priority was in COVID, and then really a focus on COVID recovery. So we're looking to move this financial year to the North Antrim court area, and we're able to scale that up fairly quickly and make that available. We also have a piece of work within probation to do with the judiciary to give that confidence in ECO and its effectiveness, and just to bring that emphasis to it again, because it was a pilot for so long and there has been a question mark as to whether it is going to continue on. So there's a piece of work for us to do, and certainly I'm engaging at a senior level with the Lady Chief Justice in her office and keeping her informed as to our plans, and our local probation officers are linking with the district judges in those areas to make sure that they're aware that this is available in that third court area going forward.
Just want to, before I move on to my last question, just hone on a wee bit on that, if that's okay. So I'm just really interested in how those areas are selected, like what metrics are used, and also what metrics are used in measuring success.
I'll answer the second one first. I mean, the economic appraisal that was undertaken by NISRA in 2021, which Hugh talked about in terms of that wider fiscal benefit, which is referenced in the Audit Office report, which was between 5.7 and 8.3 million per year on a full rollout. How they had got to that was that they'd looked at the full cost of an ECO order, they looked at the savings to prison, the benefits of unpaid work, because obviously there's an unpaid work element to it, and then the benefits to wider society, which would be things like the tax income if people were in work, and calculated that. So it is a fairly robust economic appraisal that was undertaken by Ulster University along with NISRA in the Department of Justice. And it has also been looked at, and a colleague, Sean, had talked about best practice. It has been looked at by the House of Lords inquiry in terms of community sentences as a really effective community sentence, and it has been looked at in those jurisdictions with a view to rolling it out also. In terms of how we pick the areas, a lot of it is to do with where we would, whenever you're starting to do something at pace, where we maybe have staff and capacity and the judges are willing and able to do that. Obviously Belfast is enormous for us and there would be significant costs, so that has really prevented a focus at this stage until we would have a firm commitment on cost around the rollout to Belfast, just given the scale that would be involved and just some of the challenges that we've had within probation in relation to availability even of social workers and recruitment and attrition of staff. But it isn't much more than actually the willingness in the area and also us having the resources available at that time to be able to scale it up.
forgive me, Chair. Mr. Lorgy asked a question as well about annual cycles, and actually that feeds very much into that planning piece as well. So it is indubitably the case that most people will say, having a multi-year settlement, you know what you're going to get, you can plan on a long term, and that allows for a more kind of consistent and embedding rollout of ecos or anything else, as the case might be. I think the Finance Minister himself said yesterday, I think he used the phrase, it'll be a game changer, on the assumption that the comprehensive spending review at UK level is going to lead to a multi-year budget from the executive. So that essentially, that is what we all think as well, in terms of how you plan and deliver sensible developments in activity.
Okay, that's useful. And it's just for clarity, really, around my own understanding of it. So thanks for providing that detail. And I suppose one of the measurables, which is, I imagine, much more difficult for you, is the longevity of this, because while you can measure the essential economic impact and the short term, kind of it's more hard to measure those over longer term as well. So that's probably something which I'm sure you work on the planning. But just my last point is around the electronic tagging. So when that's used effectively, obviously it can have good results when used effectively. Again, and I imagine the answer might be very similar, but is there a reason why that hasn't been rolled out in specific circumstances?
So again, Chair, for me, resources will play into this. Electronic monitoring, tagging, again, we put in a transformation bid. We've been successful in relation to that one. It's a relatively small amount of money. We have an existing contract with a provider. It's just come to an end, actually, but the previous contract with the provider was essentially based on the older technology. We're now in a place to move into the new technology, subject to ministerial approval, and there'll be human rights and data protection issues to think through and so on, but that we think there's applications there, for example, for remand, for again, helping judges be confident about bailing people into the community rather than remanding them into custody, because you can have more precise information about where they are, or you can design your bail conditions in a more specific way rather than just being based on the old technology. Similarly, we think about monitoring prisoners perhaps who've been released on licence, or people who are under various constraints in terms of probation orders. So we do think there's a huge scope there to do things A, innovatively, B, differently, but also then to provide the kind of confidence to judges which would reduce the population in the prisons, which helps Beverly and colleagues do more with the people who come in with them. And in terms of avoiding short sentences and things like that, it is more likely to lead to less of the kind of disruption that Amanda was saying happens to people's lives from short sentences. None of these are soft or easy options. They're tough community orders that people are required to comply with, including the very notion of tagging is physical kind of location monitoring, but increasing chances of less reoffending in future is proven by the kind of research which shows that keeping people in the community rather than imposing a short sentence is a better solution.
I suppose in balancing that as well, you've touched on the element that I wanted to finish on was the human rights consequences and I suppose concerns that people have around that. So can you just kind of detail for us, obviously we're looking at a financial side of it, which is important and so on, but the human rights compliancy and the having people's human rights upheld is obviously paramount in all of this. So obviously that takes precedence over anything else. So what engagement have you had with human rights organisations on that? Can you tell us about their opinion of it? Because I'm just conscious, and I know your role obviously is much more wide than kind of what we're asking you today, but I suppose it's important for our committee to have an awareness that while we're looking at this from a financial point of view, there are human rights implications. So just to assure us that any of the methods that we're looking at are actually human rights compliant.
I confess I can't immediately answer the engagement we've had. If you mean, for example, the Human Rights Commission, I don't immediately know that, but I'm happy to write to the committee about it. But I can assure the committee and indeed the entire Assembly and members of the Justice Committee and everybody else, everything the Department of Justice does is done with human rights in mind. We hold victims first and foremost. We are there to protect victims and protect society. We do everything we can to vindicate the rights of victims. We would deal very regularly with the Victims Commissioner and others in that regard. In terms of perpetrators, absolutely, rights apply there as well. The department, like every other bit of the public sector, can only lawfully act in accordance with the convention rights, and I assure that we will do all of the necessary as we roll out any intervention, for example ecos, or for example the bill to come before the Assembly can only come before the Assembly once it's been signed off by the Speaker as within the competence, i.e. including civil convention rights, etc. So, but we will do all of our piece in relation to that, and the Minister has no intention, and neither does the Department, in breaching people's human rights, even to provide value for money. There are limits. We will do what we can to balance all of those things, and people's rights to be protected by the Department, and indeed the courts and the PSNI and probation and everybody else who acts in this area.
Yeah. No, of course, it was just to get the clarity around just what engagement that had taken place to give that assurance. So I appreciate that. Thanks very much for your answers. They've given me a lot of clarity on some of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to bring Colin, but I just, Amanda, sorry, you mentioned about social workers in Belfast, and I just wanted to touch on the difficulties with recruiting additional social workers, particularly onto the likes of the probation board, and what impact is this lower number or vacancies having then on reoffending, and is that being measured, monitored, and then addressed?
Chair, thank you, and I appreciate the question. It has been a challenge for us, and I have spoken to the Justice Committee fairly regularly and with political leaders whenever I'm out visiting offices or doing local engagements around some of the challenges that we've had. Fortunately, last year the Department gave us the investment to be able to modernise our pay. That has been implemented, and we have seen a significant reduction in our attrition rates. The difficulty that is presented for us probably at present, we don't have a huge amount of vacancies, but we're actually stopping the people leaving, which was what we were trying to do, and with really positive indications that from whenever we implemented pay modernisation, people were staying. They weren't leaving to take a similar job somewhere else in the public sector. The difficulty that we have at the minute is that we have a huge cohort of really inexperienced staff. And we lost a number of experienced staff who went with a 22-point pay scale. That now has been reduced to a 6-point pay scale. So it has stopped, but what we have is a huge amount of investment and a pressure on our experienced social workers to manage what Beverly referred to as an increasingly challenging complex caseload that we have within probation. But thankfully it has been sorted, and I have happy to report that I have very few vacancies at the minute, but obviously any scaling up of any projects that we would have to consider, we would need to look at the impact of, for example, on children's services and others who are really struggling at the minute, particularly given that it takes 3 or 4 years for social workers to come through the system, and some of the other initiatives and areas where they are under significant pressure.
No, thank you, appreciate that. Sorry, Colin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. My question in this section is around adult restorative justice, and just to declare that I recently met with CRJ Ireland based in Newry and South Armagh and heard at first hand some of the good work and invaluable work that they're doing. Your department launched a strategy on this in 2022. The Minister in her foreword set out that experience from here and in the north and elsewhere has proven the benefit of a restorative approach across a range of applications. The strategy then sets out some of the benefits of it, which include victims having their voice heard, and also the impact on desistance, which we referenced earlier. It goes on to state, in addition, and I'm quoting from it directly here, in addition to these, there is evidence that facing up to the consequences of your crime and restorative engagement with your victim can actually reduce future reoffending. The Home Office research conducted by Shapland et al. Demonstrated a 27% drop in the frequency of reoffending following a restorative conference. So my question in relation to that is, can you outline the measures that have been implemented so far from the strategy and summarise the role restorative justice currently plays in addressing adult reoffending here in the North?
Really helpful, Mr. Goodwin. The strategy was published. It's the first strategic approach to restorative justice published locally, published in Northern Ireland. The whole idea is that it improves engagement with and outcomes for victims and develop positive restorative alternatives to traditional justice disposals and so on. The youth justice framework experience in this regard has been really telling. Youth conferences and other interventions in that sphere can be seen to have all sorts of very positive benefits, not least in reoffending, but in all sorts of ways for victims and society as a whole and so on. It's monitored, so there's a restorative justice working group which reports into reducing reoffending group, which Beverly chairs and so on, but it monitors the actions in the plan, and there's any number of actions in the plan that we're going to work through. But we've already got 2 annual progress reports published. Very happy to forward those on to the committee to show how far we've got. We've published kind of below the strategy, but a restorative justice protocol was published in 2023. We're doing ongoing work to refresh our interim protocol, to revise the protocol and so on, and we're heading towards an accreditation framework, the idea of which is we can allow more organisations in order to perform this work for us and practice standards for them. We needed to do a bit of legislation in order to get powers devolved from essentially UK Gov to the Department in relation to it. That's an amendment to the Justice Bill from 2010, as I understand it. So we're progressing all of those things, and then we're also we're using it to develop a strategic approach to restorative justice in the prisons establishment, with NIPS itself working on a restorative practice framework. So I hope that gives some reassurance about the kind of activities we're driving on in relation to it. Beverly, do you want to add?
I suppose what I would just one thing to add is that our intention is that in terms of those new standards, practice standards, that we will have those new processes in place by the end of this year. So that would allow us then to allow organisations to register to be an accredited restorative justice practitioner and deliverer, and would allow us to roll that work out more widely, and both across communities but also within prisons. And where we have partnered with 2 organisations currently within prisons and delivering some work, it's fair to say we've a way to go with that. And once we have those standards and framework in place, then we will be seeking to roll that out within prisons and extend that within prisons.
And I think that, and thank you for the answers, and I think that that is very, very welcome. All of that would have huge benefits for housing and education and health as well. So that's worth, and in financially constrained times, I think there's huge benefit in that. So I'd welcome that further information you've offered to send. I'd look forward to receiving that. But thank you for that. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Move on to Tom.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your responses so far. In 2016, a sentencing policy review was brought forward, led to recommendations being published in April 2021, which advocated for the developing community disposals as an alternative to short-term sentences. 9 years has now passed since this review was initially announced. So can you give us some indication as to what progress has been made in implementing the review recommendations?
Absolutely. So the review itself, the policy review is concluded. I appreciate it was commenced in 2016, but it was concluded in 2021. Where we're going with it, for example, we have considered, part of the recommendation in the report is to consider alternatives for the judges. We are looking, as Sean mentioned, and very happy to give some more detail on adding a community element to suspended sentences. That's going to come that'll be worked into the bill, which is going to come to the House this autumn. We have looked, as Sean says, at another aspect of this, which is also in the Audit Office recommendation, which is about the use of short sentences, the use of prison as a last resort, and don't have short sentences of less than 12 months, etc. So, and again, very happy to give more detail on it, but we have considered that. We think there's still learning to be had from what Scotland has done, from what Wales has done. Sean indicated that when Scotland did something similar, albeit about 3 months, there seemed to be a kind of an unanticipated outcome, which is the judges just handed 4-month sentences out, as opposed to moving to the alternatives. So we have moved on in relation to those things. From recollection, enhanced combination orders were also part of that review, and as discussed, we've already got those out in 2 court areas, and we're now pushing it out in relation to a 3rd. Forgive me, and I think I've already mentioned, but this element, we're going to, Minister and House agreeing that you will have legislation brought forward to the House on suspended sentences and adding a community element to them. So all of those flow from that sentencing review, and that is all work which either is in place already, because we have things like ECOs in place, or is going to be brought before the Assembly effectively at the earliest opportunity. So in terms of a legislative programme for the Department as a whole, Department of Justice, members will be aware, is usually quite a busy user of Assembly time in terms of legislation, just because of the kind of world that we work in and the kind of things we need to deal with. So the Minister has relatively limited slots for doing legislation in this mandate, and she's agreed on a programme which includes sentencing, but she's also trying to work in a general justice bill which is in front of the House at the moment, and she's also trying to work in a victims bill, for example, to put the Victims Commissioner on a statutory footing before the end of the mandate. So it has been tight, and she's had to make choices about what she wants to put in, and the Justice Committee will have its view and the Assembly will have its view, and that's competing with everybody else and all the other ministers who want to get their legislation in front of yourselves and your colleagues.
Yeah, well, given the high ratio of short-term prisoners in Northern Ireland and the associated reoffending risks, do you see that legislation to address this will be brought forward in this Assembly term?
Very much so, and the Minister has already agreed her view on what the content would be. She's already gone to the Executive. Member will be aware you need executive approval for the policy content of a bill before it can be drafted. We're now in the stage of getting it drafted with colleagues who are specialists in that area, and with the intention is to bring the bill forward again. It will have to go back to executive for approval for introduction, but on the assumption that the executive will continue to be content with it, you will see it introduced in the House in the autumn, and that will contain those sentencing elements.
Oh, thank you.
Forgive me, the intent being to push. We have a heavy legislative agenda for the department as a whole. This is only one aspect of it. If the member's interested, there's quite a lot of other issues which would go into the sentencing bill. So, for example, we're going to talk about the general principles of sentencing. Sean is probably more expert in that than me. If you want to add something.
Yeah, I think it's very important to realise that this is a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, the Minister is very keen to take forward measures which will address the challenge of short sentences, but equally is also in the same legislation seeking to address the very real concerns the public have about protection and appropriate punishment for appropriate crime. So on the one hand, there will be a chapter in this legislation which is specifically about community disposals, with the focus on being able to add more community components to sentences. Main focus is going to be on suspended sentences. So where previously someone might have received a custodial sentence, the intention is that this legislation will give a judge the confidence to instead impose a suspended sentence, because he or she can add a community component to it. But at the same time, there are other areas where sentences are going to be increased. There's a chapter looking at tariffs for murder, for example, which will be setting out clearer guidelines for the commencement of the tariff, the lower end, and the maxima as well. There are also areas where new offences are being created. So attacks on public frontline workers. There are new offences being created which do carry custodial sentences. There are going to be the introduction of aggravators. So, for example, crimes against vulnerable people and elderly people. The fact that the person was elderly or vulnerable, or elderly and vulnerable, can be taken into account by the judge when sentencing. So it is a balance of trying to make sure that where people can be safely disposed of, and it's not a soft option, as the Permanent Secretary mentioned, in the community, we're trying to promote that and give the judges more options in that space, but at the same time recognising that the public are concerned and are entitled to be concerned about their safety and protection, and for other sentences, tariffs will actually increase.
Thank you.
Thank you. Diane?
Thank you, and thank you all for your evidence so far. The next sort of section that we have some questions on are specific issues associated with remand prisoners, and I find it shocking to hear that some 47% of prisoners that were committed to remand in 2020 did not ultimately then receive a prison sentence. And just want to ask, would you agree this confirms how unsatisfactory the current arrangements for the judiciary are when determining whether bail can be granted?
So I suppose it's worth just stepping back one step for a moment, just to remind ourselves. So the basic principle is that somebody is innocent until presumed guilty. If brought before a court in relation to a particular charge and heading towards trial, the judge will be asked to decide, is this person to be remanded into custody, or is this person safe to bail into the community? In relation to remanding into custody, there are set common law grounds on which that would be justified. Clearly, it is an infringement of liberty of the individual who is being put into custody. None of this is about the guilt of the individual for the charge at hand, but the tests, for example, include is there a likelihood that there will be interference with evidence or interference with a witness which might prejudice the outcome of the trial? Is there a likelihood of doing further offences? Is there a likelihood of harm to the individual or others? Is there a likelihood of disruption of public order and so on? So those are the tests that the judge in each individual case will decide on as to whether the person is remanded into custody. What we try and do is provide, for example, the opportunities that if the judge is thinking of remanding into custody, he or she might be minded instead to bail the person into the community, for example, with tagging, for example, with curfew, for example, with other constraints. But the judge is satisfied that the tests maybe can be met in a slightly different way by allowing the person in the community. Absconding is another risk. So if the judge thinks that the person might abscond before facing trial, then the judge, again, is entitled to remand the person into prison. Once the person is there, we do work with them and we provide opportunities to people who are remanded in. As mentioned, the average remand length from recollection is only 58 days. I appreciate there will be longer ones and shorter ones than that. Remand prisoners don't always engage with us as much as we would like them to. For example, if we're offering behavioural change programmes or education, sometimes remand prisoners think, well, look, if I go into that, I'm effectively admitting that in some way there's something wrong with my behaviour, i.e. I'm guilty, and there's naturally a resistance in relation to that. But we do work with them and provide an offering. Beverly, do you want to give some more detail on it?
And I suppose it's the challenge is when someone's on remand, we don't know how long they will be with us. So that's why we focused on enhancing the provision for those who are with us for short periods of time. So those shorter education programmes, employability programmes, providing support for those who 55% of people who come into prison tell us they have an addiction issue, working with them around providing this support around those issues in partnership with colleagues in South Eastern Trust who deliver healthcare in prisons. So we do focus on tailored support for those who are on remand.
So just to repeat kind of the substance of my question, with 47% of the prisoners who've been committed to remand not going on to get a prison sentence, so you're saying you are satisfied with the current arrangements that have us in this position?
Well, I mean, ultimately the decision to remand somebody into custody is taken by a judge. It's not and that is an independent judicial decision, and it's not for me or any part of the executive to challenge it or disagree with it and so on. But also then not logically speaking, some of the people who are remanded into custody are actually then tried and acquitted, so they're not going to see any kind of custodial sentence. Some of them will be tried but will have spent such a period on remand that actually the judge will simply say, well, look, you've spent that period on remand and that therefore meets the sentence I was going to impose, so you're released at that stage. So in terms of whether I'm satisfied with it or not, I suppose for me to be dissatisfied or dissatisfied with it would be to be kind of criticising what the judges do, which isn't really my role. In relation to bail, though, we have looked and thought about whether we could do things in relation to the setup in relation to bail. I'm conscious there was a Law Commission recommendation that we consolidate bail law. That appears in the Audit Office report as well. We think that doesn't really change an awful lot. We don't think that merely taking the common law, putting it in a statute, bringing it before the House and reiterating it is going to change the remand figures. We have looked at other aspects of it, Sean.
As Home Secretary said, we have looked at this. I mean, the 2012 Northern Ireland Law Commission, although they did recommend consolidation of the law, they didn't recommend any change to the conditions for bail being granted. And has been said, you would struggle to decide which of those conditions you would alter, because you must grant bail unless there is a risk that you're going to interfere with the process of justice, unless there is no risk that you're going to process of justice, reoffending, harm to self and others. I don't think that when that's been looked at by both the Criminal Justice Board and the Northern Ireland Law Commission, and the Minister has considered it, there was any appetite to amend any of those things. And again, we do look at what's happening in other jurisdictions. There has been a bail bill in Scotland, and we've looked very carefully. The Scottish Government's own assessment of that bail bill is that it will not change the numbers who get bail and the numbers who go on to remand. It is about consolidating law, and there is a recommendation we should do the same. We agree with that, but given the shortened mandate, it just wasn't the priority compared to both sentencing bill and the victims bill and a consolidated justice bill. But that doesn't mean there aren't things. We're trying to increase the number of situations where a judge is minded to offer bail by expanding bail support programs. Now, I wouldn't be the best place to answer, but that is to try and give greater confidence to a judge that bail is appropriate by having a bail support offer, as opposed to interfering with the grounds for bail through a Bail Act.
And that bail support programme is something we're developing currently. It's something that we learnt from others in respect to the Five Nations group. That's something that England and Wales and Scotland are looking at. So we are developing a pilot programme to deliver bail support scheme for females. We've saw a significant increase in females in the prison population, and particularly a significant increase in females on remand. So today we've 120 females in prison and 50% of them are in remand. Currently there isn't an alternative. Judges don't have that offering that they may have in other jurisdictions, so we're developing that proposal and working across government and with Lady Chief Justice Office around the development of that proposal.
Okay, and then in terms of the high percentage of those committed to remand who don't go on to receive a prison sentence, have you any idea of the cost to the taxpayer each year for those?
The cost of keeping a prisoner generally in the prison estate is approximately £50,000, and that wouldn't be noticeably different between remand prisoners and other prisoners.
I mean, you know, of those who have been held in remand who don't go on then to receive a prison sentence, you don't isolate that figure?
We have the costs of a prisoner place per year. You can break that down to, you know, a week or a day, which breaks down to about £148 a day for a prisoner in a prison in Northern Ireland. And if you take that to a remand population, that's, you know, we don't have those figures beyond that.
Thank you. And next question, you've kind of touched on a wee bit there already, Beverly, but in the context of the discussion in and around prisons being overcrowded and that 37% of the prison population in 21-22 were those held on remand, just wanted to ask what work you've done to consider the issues around bail legislation, bail information, and you talked about the bail support programmes and things like bail hostels.
So that, in terms of the bail legislation, as indicated, we have looked. If it's any reassurance to the member in the committee, it's not just the department saying that we think this. The Criminal Justice Board, which includes representatives from all across the system at the most senior level, had a look at the proposal that we would do something on bail law, and it's content that existing bail law is fit for purpose. We will continue to keep that under review. As Sean was saying, we'll watch what is happening elsewhere. But we think there are practical things that we can do. For example, the bail support pilot that Beverly was talking about, which again is intended to assist the likelihood of a judge feeling confident enough to give bail, instead of remanding into women's prison, to give bail to the individual to go back into the community, subject to strict controls, because bail is always going to be subject to the strict controls that the judge puts on it. But if we can provide some support which is likely to help the individual not breach those conditions, then again that is likely to keep a person out of the prison estate, and we think that's a viable alternative. We bid for transformation money in relation to this as well. You're hearing that a lot from me today. We were quite optimistic. We didn't get it, but again the Minister has recognising the impact that it has, both on the individuals and both on the rest of the prison population. We think there's merit in piloting it, so we've secured 500,000 or thereabouts in order to fund it this year. And if it's any reassurance, we have looked elsewhere, not just the Five Nations, but New Zealand, Australia, Canada, other international jurisdictions. We have looked at them to see what other people are doing and to try and learn from that and try and find solutions to these problems.
It's good to see the department is ambitious with transformation bids, and hopefully we'll see more coming through in the next round as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Colin?
Karen, I thank the panel for their time and also their answers, and apologise that I'm not in the room to ask my questions in person. But in addition to the large numbers of remand prisoners here and the length of time taken to process court cases, means that these prisoners are often spending longer periods of time in custody. When the Office Audit reported, when the Audit Office reported the completion time for court cases has increased from 162 days to 226 days between 2017-18 and 2021-22. Can I ask, what is the current position and what is being done to ensure a more efficient court processing system?
I think I heard it. Yes, forgive me, Mr. Crawford. Just the sound wasn't very good here. I think the question is about the increase in disposal times in the court, which the Audit Office identified as up to 226, and what we're doing in relation to that. Because absolutely, we agree. It logically speaking feeds into the extension of time on remand. So if I have that question right, the current latest figures that we have in relation to that are 190 days. So separate from the reoffending piece, separate from the offending piece, the Criminal Justice Board is also responsible for a programme in relation to speeding up justice, eradicating delay from the justice system. There are other participants in that, but we totally agree that the entire system is interconnected, so it's incredibly valid and incredibly relevant. That's a programme of activity which is across all of the partners. It's not just inside the department, and it's intended to drive out unnecessary delay. What we've done is we've had a look at the systemic issues. We've tried to identify where delay arises in the, if you imagine the passage of a person through the criminal justice system from first detection from PSNI out to finally finishing at the other end after, for example, some kind of supervision period in the community. We're trying to identify, and we have identified, where the hotspots of delay. We've used those to identify 5 projects which are wrapped up in a programme. The core idea in the programme is to eradicate delay, but we're doing that, for example, by increasing out-of-court disposals. So that would see fewer cases actually coming to court because, for example, they might be dealt with a prosecutorial fine or the equivalent of a fixed penalty notice or a community resolution notice from the police. So we think the scope for the very lowest level of offending to make efficiencies there, and also to get a kind of a more suitable disposal rather than occupying court time, which everybody agrees is precious and expensive. We have a digital reform programme going on. There's a very substantial piece of work being done in the courts in relation to Themis, and there are other digital improvements. For example, there are a few places where you still need a physical document or a physical signature, so we're looking at what legislation is needed to change that so we can do things digitally more easily. And we're looking at things like committal reform. So committal reform is a reform programme based on this notion that before you're committed to the Crown Court, there's all sorts of preliminary steps in the Magistrates Court, and we think there's a lot of inefficiency there. The House legislated it for some time ago, so we're trying to bring into place by November of next year the final stage of committal reform, so you won't have those relatively time-consuming, relatively low-value interventions in the Magistrates Court. Instead, we can just really get the whole thing started in the Crown Court. If it's that serious level of case, let's just go straight to the Crown Court. So there are a couple of other projects in there, but they're maybe some of the kind of obvious ones. The whole objective is to drive out delay and to provide a smoother system and therefore better justice faster, which is good for victims, it's good for system, it's good for society. I suppose from a PAC view, it's good for value for money as well. And as I said, the headline figure across all court cases, we've got down from 226 at, I think that was the high point, and we've got it down to 190. There are variable rates, I don't have them to hand, but for example, the Crown Court, logically speaking, cases take longer than Magistrates Court, and if the member and Youth Court takes a different length of time as well, and so on. But if the member is interested, we can provide a bit more detail to the committee about those.
And then in order to improve rehabilitation and resettlement outcomes for remand prisoners, it's extremely important, and the ways can be found to encourage or incentivize those prisoners that actively engage with prison-based programs. Can you tell us the work that has been done in this area and whether it's been effective?
You hear? Yeah. I think the question was about, in relation to remand prisoners, what are we doing to encourage and incentivise them to engage with our offering? Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Beverly?
Okay, so what we do when every prisoner comes into custody, we engage with them on what we call a prisoner needs profile. That's the first stage, and if you like, the rehabilitation programme for people in prison. So we look at their specific needs, We look at their aspirations, and then we develop with them a prisoner development programme. That opportunity is available to all prisoners, whether they be remand or sentence. We offer that opportunity, and we've tailored programmes, as I've said earlier, to that cadre. The challenge for us, as I think Hugh said earlier, is that some remand prisoners will view engaging in behavioural programmes as an admission of guilt in advance of a court hearing, so we'll choose not to engage in those. But we are having good success and growing success in encouraging remand prisoners to engage in those, if you like, education and rehabilitative type programmes, say around drug and alcohol abuse. So yes, we are seeing improvements in those, we are seeing increased uptake in those, and we'll continue to work to develop that. And the review of our prisoner development model, our rehabilitation model that's ongoing, will hopefully provide us with some recommendations around how we can better tailor that to deal with that increasing remand population, increasing prison population, and the increasing complexity of people who come into prison with increasing levels of poor mental health and increasing issues with addictions.
That's great. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Colin. Diane?
Yeah, thank you. And in this environment where we've got limited funding, it's important that we make the best use of our public money. And just given the rise in prison population, I think you had touched on it earlier, but I want to know a bit more detail about what initiatives you've taken forward with the voluntary and community sector, focusing on the prevention of reoffending.
We do a very substantial amount of work with the voluntary community sector, and we're really, really grateful to them for partnering us in all sorts of ways. From recollection, we've got something like 19 or 20 different partners doing all sorts of different things, different parts of the system, to be fair, and indeed outside reoffending, we have them doing. Clearly, places like Niacro, Extern, they work with us in various programmes. I've mentioned the short sentence prisoners transition programme, which Extern help us with. And it's particularly useful because there are things that we can do inside the prison, and Extern help us with that, but then they can take the journey much further than we can outside the prison once the person has gone beyond our confines. Beverly, do you want to give any more detail on it?
And we really couldn't deliver the rehabilitation work we do within prisons without the support of those voluntary community sector organisations. They bring a particular skill set that we don't have. Prison officers are very skilled individuals. They deliver a particular role, but they don't have the range of skill sets that those in the voluntary community sector have. So they are extremely key and valued partners within prison setting, but also without, because those organisations have a reach both within and without prison, so they can provide that support as people leave and continue to provide that support as people leave.
No, brilliant. I totally agree with you, and I just wonder, do you collect any data around that, or as you move forward with the collation of data across different departments, would the capturing of those linked with the voluntary community sector be a part of that?
Absolutely, and with all of the funding that we provide to voluntary community sector organisations to provide services within prisons, we have action plans and report cards, so we monitor the impact, we know what impact they have, and as we take forward development of an executive strategy, it won't just be other government departments and statutory bodies that we'll be engaging with on that. It will be those voluntary and community sector organisations who've provided that valuable service within prisons for many years, so we will be engaging with them as we develop that strategy.
Oh, that's great to hear, and just to declare I'm chair of the all-party group and voluntary community sector, just should have said that at the start of that as well.
Glad to declare that, Chair.
We're engaged with a huge range, so there's a chaplaincy service, which all the churches contribute to that and so on. You can imagine what kind of work they do. Prison Arts Foundation, we've hostel providers, we've the restorative justice places, we've crews, as I said, there's 19 or 20 that we are engaged with. They will change from time to time as programmes are relet or whatever, but the value that they bring to it and the breadth of ability to do things that they bring to it is huge as well. Not so much in the prisons, but Probation Board does this as well. Amanda, isn't that right?
Yes, we have a focus similarly with the community and voluntary sector, but probably I would say at the outset that we're based in local communities for a very good reason. We have a dual role. We have the responsibility to risk manage people, but we also reintegrate and resettle people back into the community. So it's really important for probation services to be based in local communities and to have those networks and supports because they're very often there whenever the statutory sector move away, and community service is a fantastic example of people being seen to give reparation back to the community for the harm that they've done, and face up to that. And that's a really powerful tool that we're keen to develop further and to give confidence in the judiciary. It isn't used as much as we would like it to be used, and we are really keen, and we've been given a push at it, certainly within the senior leadership team and by the board. But similarly, we also fund a number of the CVS partners to support some of the work that we do alongside people to address employment issues, mentoring, even just the chaotic lifestyle of some of the people that we're working with, getting them to an appointment, and bringing people in to do that type of mentoring through NIACRO, where they actually take them to the appointment to make sure they're getting access to the services, and supporting them through that journey, which is about the risk management, but ultimately enabling them to reintegrate into the community.
If it's any reassurance to the member, it has been really tight over recent years, as the member knows, and so on, but we've managed to protect the core funding of the CVS partners, as I understand it, throughout, certainly since I've been in the department and since the Minister came back, in recognition of the value of what they do, and also in recognition of the harm that it can do to them as bodies, and then the services that they provide if they're subjected to, as Mr. Delargy was asking, the kind of vagaries of single-year funding and absence of long-term commitment. And it's another reason why we're really keen to get to multi-year budgets, so we can plan that and plan in partnership with all of those community and voluntary partners.
Great, thank you. It's a key part of, as we're transforming public services, to remember that they're further than just the departments and government bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I'm just going to bring Kathleen. I think you wanted some clarity.
Just a couple of clarity, yeah. Q, you made that many bids. I'll not be sending to the auction house just in case, you know what I mean? God knows what you come, but fair play to you. See, just the 374 figure you mentioned early on in terms of the
yes.
overall cost. And can you give us a breakdown in relation to that? Maybe not now, but send it on just overall. Yeah.
Once we get the report completely finalised, proofed and ready for purpose, we're going to publish it, but we'll get it to the committee as soon as we can. We're really keen to have other people looking at it, so as with all of the department's research, we want it to be challenged in a sense. If there's other academics out there, John Kerr and my colleagues in the department who've done this, they have spoken widely to people about it, but if there's any input, we're really happy to have it. In terms of a headline breakdown, it's using the same methodology that is used, for example, by Home Office. And in the cost of crime report, which is a bigger thing, we break it down into anticipation costs, consequence costs, and response costs. So anticipation costs are things like insurance, putting up security measures, alarms, essentially kind of anticipation that crime might happen to you, both individual and business. Consequence cost is that it is that kind of consequence. I have lost broken windows in my house, I have been injured, whatever the car has been damaged, whatever. So we attribute an economic cost to that. There is absolutely a human and social cost to it as well. And then a response cost, which is very much about kind of policing and investigation and so on. And the breakdown for those is anticipation approximately 9 million, consequence 247 million, and response costs 117 million. Making up that roughly 374. May not totally round to that, just to do with my maths.
Sure, just one wee final question, because the dashboard, because they all use dashboards, but it's only as good as the information you gather, let's be fair. So how do we ensure going forward, because we had the talk about remand and rehabilitation and who's using and who's not. We need to get the proper data if it's going to be properly. It's a good system, it's a good metric, all right, but we need to ensure we're getting the right information and the right data. Because if it's going to be outcomes based, and we're using data, it needs to be right.
And the work we're doing around developing the dashboards that we have developed and are developing, we're working with NISRA colleagues on that to ensure that we do it right.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Members, is there any other questions? No. So TOA, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
Chair, just maybe worth making one contextual point. I think in terms of the discussions today, it struck me from a Department of Finance perspective, the timing of this inquiry I think is really critical. Mr. Willis talked about this being an invest to save area, and I think the fact that the executive are looking at the final budget today for 25/6 is important. But I think looking ahead, we're 2 months out from the spending review, which will kickstart bulk of the multi-year budget that we've touched on at different stages today. And I think as well, Chair, the work on budget sustainability
and those 5-year plans is going to be absolutely critical in this area. And I think some of the numbers that Mr. Boylan was asking around there in terms of reducing those costs long term, it feels like in terms of timing, programme for government's in place, strategy, multi-year budget, there's a real opportunity here for some long-term progress in this area. So I think that window of opportunity is opening for us in this area. So look forward to the rest of this inquiry.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much for those points. CNAG, have you any comments to make? No. Well, thank you so much. I know we have noted some things we may come back just for further clarity or for further information, but I want to thank you all for your time here today and coming before the committee. Thank you, Mr. Wittes, Miss Wall, Mr. Holland and Mrs. Stewart for attending, and we really appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and committee, thank you so much. I certainly found that very useful. I hope colleagues did as well. I hope we've assured you in terms of progress that we've made since getting the report, and indeed before. I'm really happy to come back with further information once we get further on the journey on the cross-departmental strategy. I'm conscious as well the Audit Office recognised the incredible work that people do. I maybe haven't touched on that. I've talked a lot about kind of high-level numbers and cohorts and so on, but behind all of these stories there is a victim, and we are very conscious of that in terms of reducing reoffending so we don't get more victims in future. And that is done by the incredible work of individuals in probation service, in prison service, through the voluntary community sector, with our partners in education and health services who come and help us with this whole journey. So I'm incredibly grateful both to the Audit Office for recognising that in its report, and I would kind of reiterate it here today. But it's been a really useful opportunity for us, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Members, thank you.
Members, we will now move into closed session.
Senate Chamber. Sound. 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 Senate Chamber. Signed. 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 Senate Chamber. Sound. 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 Senate Chamber. Signed. 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 Senate Chamber. Sound. 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 Senate Chamber. signed, Senate Chamber, 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 signed,